Buonasera, benvenuti a tutti, in particolare ai nostri ospiti, Angus Deaton e Alessandro Merli. L'occasione dell'incontro di oggi è l'uscita in traduzione italiana del loro libro, vi mostro, Morti per disperazione e il futuro del capitalismo, che è uscito negli Stati Uniti e è stato già tradotto in una decina di lingue, un libro quindi che sta avendo intorno un grande interesse. Anzitutto vi voglio ricordare che Anne Case, a cui si deve il lavoro di ricerca che sta alla base di questo libro, è professoressa di Economics and Public Affairs nell'Università di Princeton. L'altro autore, Angus Deaton, è professore emerito nella stessa università dove insegna Economics and International Affairs. Economista di spicco, nel 2015 Angus Deaton ha ricevuto il premio Nobel per l'economia. In Italia è conosciuto perché è già stato tradotto il suo libro precedente, l'ha tradotto il Mulino, La grande fuga, salute, ricchezza e le origini della diseguaglianza. A condurre la conversazione sarà Alessandro Merli, e la conversazione sarà naturalmente in lingua inglese, come sapete. Alessandro Merli è fellow della Scuola di Studi Internazionali della Johns Hopkins University a Bologna, insegna alla Bologna Business School. In precedenza ha lavorato per il Sole 24 Ore, tra l'altro come corrispondente da Londra e da Francoforte. Come dicevo, l'occasione è l'uscita di questo libro. E questa sera si parlerà del drammatico incremento dei decessi per suicidio, overdose e alcolismo che c'è stata negli Stati Uniti. Queste morti per disperazione, come le hanno chiamate gli autori, sono centinaia di migliaia all'anno. A questo si aggiunge che negli Stati Uniti l'aspettativa di vita è calata per 3 anni consecutivi. Dunque siamo davanti a una degenerazione che non è solo americana, ma deve mettere in guardia gli altri paesi dell'Occidente dal compiere gli stessi drammatici errori, perché drammatici sono. Sentiremo dunque dalla voce degli autori quali sono le possibili cause di questo fenomeno che colpisce la classe media americana, e perché pensano che comunque il sistema capitalista sia da salvare. Io mi fermo qui, passo la parola a Alessandro Merli, ricordandovi che sono previsti altri incontri in questa stessa rassegna. In aprile ci saranno altri 2 economisti, Richard Baldwin e Bina Garval, conversazioni sempre condotte da Alessandro Merli. Dunque Alessandro, a te la parola. Grazie a tutti dell'attenzione e a presto allora.
Grazie Monica, buonasera a tutti. Volevo solo ricordare che chi ci ascolta ha la possibilità di fare domande utilizzando la piattaforma, una delle varie piattaforme sulle quali state seguendo questo incontro, che sia Facebook o YouTube. You now switch to English. I would like to say good afternoon to Angus and Angus Deaton, who are our guests tonight. I started my career as a tennis reporter, and I would say that if you were tennis players, you'd probably be one of the best mixed doubles around, material for Wimbledon champions, I would say. I can think of only one other couple of economists that could rival with you. That's Janet Yellen and George Akerlof. But you definitely have Wimbledon or US Open championship material. So we're more seriously, we now switch to economics, and we would like to hear now, I think, from Anne Case, Professor Case, a presentation. After that, we'll have a dialogue with them from my side and the side of the public if there are any comments or questions.
Thank you, buonasera, and we are delighted to be here today. I'm going to share our screen to show you some of the highlights from our book, which is just published. Share? Yeah. Which has just been published in Italian. This work has grown out of a number of papers that we have written over time, and the work has been funded by the National Institutes of Health in the United States. To give you a sense of where we started this work, it's good to take a step back and think about mortality in the 20th century. There was an enormous amount of progress in the 20th century. And if you look at mortality rates, this is for men and women aged 45 to 54, whites in America. The mortality fell really dramatically over the course of the 20th century. So you can see the 1918 flu epidemic, which now the COVID, of course, is rivaling. And you can see a stretch here when people who had smoked very heavily were dying of lung cancer and heart disease. But then people stopped smoking in big numbers, so there was behavioral change. And also there was medical advance, that suddenly on the market were very effective drugs to control hypertension, high blood pressure. And progress continued, and we thought progress would just keep continuing. Why would it stop continuing? And in the rest of the rich world, that progress did continue. So here's Italia and Francia and the other English-speaking countries, and you can see mortality rates just kept falling. But that in the United States did not happen. Among whites in the United States, who are the most privileged group, actually mortality rates stopped falling in this age group and started to rise, and then flatlined and then rose again. Other groups in the US, Hispanics, for example, who are this blue line, their mortality continued to fall. Blacks in America, who have higher mortality than whites, their mortality was falling nicely. So it was this group of whites who stopped seeing progress. Now, you have to ask, well, is this a big enough change to be important? Well, it turns out that it was a big enough change that life expectancy in the US stopped falling, or stopped rising, and actually fell for 3 years in a row, from 2014 to 2017. And it was due to what was happening to mortality in midlife. The young were doing very well, the elderly were doing well, but people in midlife, their mortality rates started to rise. So part of that is we stopped making progress in the US against heart disease. But part of it was also that in addition to that, mortality rates started to rise quite dramatically for people in midlife from drugs, from suicide, and from alcoholic liver disease. Now, there's a real distinction here between what happened to people without a university degree and what happened to people with a university degree. So for people who have a laurea, who have been to college, their rates rose a little bit, but it's nothing like what happened to people who have not been to college and received a degree. And in this work, and in work that we're continuing to do, we're finding a real divide in the US between people who hold a 4-year college degree and everyone else. That everyone else is 2/3 of the adult population. So 2/3 of the population are at higher risk from these causes of death. And we coined the term deaths of despair to cover drugs and alcohol and suicide. And generally what we do is we put these three causes of death together. And in the US in 2019, so before the COVID pandemic, 164,000 people in America died of a death of despair. So that's not as big as the COVID epidemic, but unfortunately, after people are inoculated, after people receive their vaccines and COVID hopefully is gone, unfortunately, there's no reason to think that these causes of death will subside. All of the work that we do here is based on 73 million death records that we have available that anyone can go to the web and pull down and analyze. So these are a complete census of people who die in the US. Now this took us back to Emil Durkheim, who wrote about suicide in 1897. And he posited that suicide was more likely in times of great upheaval. And in the book, we argue that for the white working class, for whites without a college degree, this period was a time of great upheaval. Now, what do we know? We know that the deaths are geographically widespread. Every state, there are 50 states in the US, every state saw increases in deaths from drugs, death from suicide, death from alcohol. It's also the case, it's happening to men and to women. So if you look at the mortality rates from these causes for men and for women without a college degree, they rose pretty much in parallel from the mid-1990s through to the 20-teens. For people with a college degree, they went up a little bit, but it's really nothing relative to what happened to people without a college degree. So it's not just men, it's men and women who seem to be at risk of dying from one of these causes. And can you find the Great Recession in this picture? Because we don't see, you can't really see where it is. This was the financial crisis that started in 2008. But what you see is that the deaths of despair were rising before it, they went up a little bit during it, and they continued to rise after it. And in all of this work, we don't find that it's current unemployment or a current lack of income that seems to be driving this. We think the causes of this are older than just the immediate turn down in an economy. And then underneath those deaths, for people without a degree, there's more pain, there's more social isolation, and there's poorer mental health. So that's not in a lot of these things are self-reported, that people must self-report their pain. That's the only way we know whether someone is in pain. But the reports of pain have been going up and up and up for people without a college degree. We know social isolation is a risk factor for suicide, and people report more and more and more trouble socializing with friends. So we think of this as what's happening underneath those deaths from drugs and alcohol and suicide. So what causes this? Well, we think it's a decline in the long-term labor market for people who have not been to college in America. So if you look at men who have not been to college, so 25 to 54-year-old men without a laureate, without a 4-year degree, what we find is that their wages are falling, and long term, there's a decline in their wages. It goes up and down a little bit with the business cycle, but you can see that the long-term trend is down. And the same is true for their attachment to the labor market. that when there's a recession, that's these red lines, people lose their jobs, then they come back into the labor market, they lose their jobs again, but they never are back at what they had been to before. So there's a long-term decline here as well in being employed at all. Now, there's little wage change within a job. So the loss of wages and these lower labor force participation rates come from losing jobs and replacing them with less good jobs. And a lot of the jobs that are being replaced are what we call outsourced jobs. These are jobs that might have belonged to a large company at one time, but the company decides instead they will just hire in for transportation or for security or for food services or for cleaning. And those jobs, there's less commitment from the employer. There's less meaning in the jobs themselves. There's less of a chance of seeing yourself belonging to a large company. So in the US, for example, in these large Amazon warehouses, which they call fulfillment centers, there are some Amazon employees, but most people working in these warehouses come from outsourced labor supply company called the Integrity Staffing Solutions. And what we find is that when people don't have good jobs, in the US, they stop getting married. So they will cohabit, but unlike in many parts of Europe where cohabitations are stable, in the US, these cohabitations are quite fragile. And people break apart and then they recouple and they break apart. They will have children, but the children won't live with both the parents. So there's a real decline in stability in life. Everything is more fragile. Jobs are fragile. Home life is fragile. Community life is fragile. And in the book, we argue that what we see happening to the white working class, a lot of that looks like what happened to African Americans in the 60s and 70s when jobs left the inner cities in the US. So what happened to the white working class? We know labor was weakened by globalization and automation, but that was true in other countries as well, where we haven't seen these deaths of despair rise. So what's different about the US? And there are two things that we highlight. One is that unlike the European countries where very heavy-duty prescription opioids are controlled very carefully in hospitals, in the US, opioids began to be spread widely. Any doctor could write a prescription for a drug that was stronger than morphine. And what happened was that very greedy pharmaceutical companies targeted areas of the US where they thought that there'd be a real demand for these drugs. And they blanketed those areas with opioids. So people became addicted to prescription opioids. Once it was really so apparent that was happening, that it could not somehow fly any longer under the radar, and the tap started to turn off for prescription opioids, it turns out heroin is the perfect substitute for OxyContin, which is the main drug that was being pushed so hard. And so there was a heroin epidemic, and then most recently an epidemic of fentanyl, which is an even stronger drug. So there's been this drug crisis in America that was started by greedy pharmaceutical companies pushing these drugs very heavily. The other thing that's different about the US is that unlike other countries, other rich countries of the world, we have the craziest healthcare system in the rich world. It's the most expensive healthcare system in the world. But on many metrics, Americans have the worst health among wealthy countries. And in the book, we argue that life expectancy in the US fell not in spite of what we spend on healthcare, but because of what we spend on healthcare. And to give you a sense of how much more the US spends on healthcare than other countries, it's interesting, I think, to look at this figure. So this is life expectancy at birth and expenditure on healthcare per capita, pro capita. And you can see from 1970 to 2015 in the UK, life expectancy went up and expenditures went up. Okay, if you add Australia, it looks very similar. Canada looks similar. France, very much the same. The Swiss spend more on healthcare than these other countries. But even relative to the Swiss, which are the next most expensive, if you look at what happened in the US from 1970 to 1982, we have higher expenditure and lower life expectancy. It gets worse by 1990 and worse still by 2015. So we spend twice what other rich countries spend on healthcare, and yet our life expectancy is much lower. So we spend now almost $1.05 of US GDP goes to this industry, to the healthcare industry. The difference in spending between the Swiss, who are the next most expensive, and the US, if we only spent what the Swiss spent, we would save $1 trillion a year in the US. That's more than $8,300 for every household. And that's just the excess spending relative to the next most expensive country. It's half again as much as we spend on the entire US military. So it's out of control. And it's the case that that spending has to come from somewhere. So in the US, we have a crazy system where they tie health insurance to employment. And people oftentimes think that their employer-provided health care is a gift, but that gift is being deducted from what would be their paycheck. So we think that the lower wages for the working class in part comes from this decline. Their decline comes from the fact that the employer has to pay healthcare premia to keep this worker employed. And many firms who have to pay $21,000, their shares of a $21,000 a year premium, decide not to hire these low-wage workers, and instead those low-wage workers go to outsourced firms. These premia don't vary much by workers' earnings. So they're like a fixed per worker tax. And in the US, where we debate about the minimum wage and increasing the minimum wage may cost some jobs, well, there's not a lot of discussion on the fact that this enormous tax that an employer has to pay for health insurance could be having an effect on hiring of low-wage workers. And we think that financing healthcare in this way is like just taking a wrecking ball to the low-skilled labor market. It's also the case that state governments in the US have to pay their share of Medicaid, which provides health insurance for the poor. But those state governments then have less to spend on public universities and infrastructure. And so that also is just depleting the coffers of state governments to fund an ever more expensive healthcare industry. So what do we do? In the book, we talk about the future of capitalism, not its failure, but we think it needs to be fixed, not abandoned, but it needs to be made fairer. And we think healthcare reform is central to this. This is just an injury that the US is inflicting on itself. So maybe the COVID crisis will give us an opportunity to begin to have serious talk about healthcare reform in the US. But there are 5 lobbyists in Washington, D.C., lobbying Congress for every member of Congress. So these are a powerful industry that are going to fight tooth and nail not to see reform. And more generally, we think that corporate lobbying and also the decline in unions have left little representation for less educated workers in Washington. And there's an expression that I'm not sure how we will translate this into Italian, but we could try, that if you were not at the table, you were on the menu. So I'm going to stop there and come back hopefully to Alessandro. There he is. I don't know if you can translate, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
It's a tricky, I think it's a tricky translation. It's, I guess, it just means that I'm not sure in Italian how you translate that. Most jokes don't work very well in translations. I was just wondering, I seen your book, and of course it strikes a very different tone from a previous book that was already mentioned by Monica, The Great Escape, that was written by Professor Deaton, where you describe a very long-term process of improvement of social and economic conditions. And now here in Death of Despair, you focus on this more recent reversal. Of course, you focus, I'd say, on a specific, this happens in a specific country and a specific social class. Professor Christopher has already alluded to that, saying, well, maybe this is a permanent deviation. I was wondering if you think, this deviation is a blip, these long-term positive improvements will restart at some point if something is done, or is at risk of becoming a permanent deviation? And maybe the COVID pandemic will even make things worse, as it will accentuate some of the causes, like social isolation. It's one of the things you mentioned, and definitely social isolation is a component of the result of the COVID pandemic. So, taking again this sort of very long-term perspective rather than the perspective of the last 20 or 30 years, if you see this as a reversible situation or a blip, or something that risks becoming a permanent feature in U.S. society?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. I often think about this, having written a very optimistic book, than my book with Anne is not quite so optimistic. There are two things about the last book. I'll come back to this one. But I argued in that book that there'd been tremendous progress since the Enlightenment, essentially. But it's not a smooth process. So no one in their right mind would think that things have gotten steadily better for the last 250 years without any blips. So, just to take the 20th century, there's the Holocaust, there's the Great Leap Forward, and 30 million people died. There's all Stalin's purges, all the rest of it, the previous health crisis, HIV/AIDS, and so on. So, the history of progress is one that's certainly been interrupted before, and it's come back. And I think I argued in the book that the reason it's come back is ultimately because people want to live better lives. And also, ever since the Enlightenment, they've learned that it was possible to use the power of reason to improve lives. And that's still true. So I'm still optimistic in the long run. But come to this book and what's happening now. First of all, it's not just the US. So Deaths of Despair are rising in Britain. They're rising in Canada, in Ireland to some extent. So there's a real question that these things might spread to other countries. I don't think Italy's in danger, but some other European countries are. What I worry about most, and I think Anne too, though this is a little bit beyond, is the sort of class warfare that underlies these results. That this bad stuff is happening to people who do not have a BA, do not have a degree, whereas the rest of the population pretty much goes on, or the third of the population with a degree is doing fine. And, that is reflected in the rest of Europe too, which is, in Britain, you've got Brexit, and the people who voted against the ruling elite sort of idea. And you see it in France, and you see it in Sweden, and you so on. So that division between an educated elite and a cosmopolitan educated elite and a more nativist, less educated set of people who are left behind, that really could threaten very serious things in the long run. So that's what I worry about. But I'm still optimistic eventually, just because we do have the means, the power of reason, to go back on a better path.
You just mentioned, it was mentioned in the presentation again by Professor Case, you emphasize a lot this question of the education divide as one of the main contributing factor to this crisis, to this opioid epidemics, or this fall in mortality, in fall in life expectancy. I was wondering, you raised the alarm on this, but is there enough awareness of this, do you feel, in the US and elsewhere? I'm saying this because if I look at what's happening now with the pandemic, for instance, schools seem to have become, the education of children seem to have become almost an afterthought for public policy. There's been this struggle between the needs of health of the citizen and the needs of the economy, right? People say, well, we need to really get everybody out of the pandemic first, so lockdowns, et cetera, and other people say, no, we need to keep the economy going, et cetera. And the schools, the education system seem to have become a sort of afterthought, they were opened and closed almost at random. So I was wondering if you feel that people are aware that education is actually one of the crucial questions to be answered for solving this problem.
People are aware, but it's not so easy to turn that into decision making by policymakers who are very frightened and very divided and very polarized. So we have some evidence that the deaths from COVID during the pandemic, like the deaths we talked about here, are predominantly or much more severely among those who do not have a university degree, which also makes sense because those are the essential workers. The international evidence and some of the domestic evidence suggests there's not much of a trade-off, that basically if you control the pandemic, the places that have controlled the pandemic have done much better economically. So it's not sort of one or the other, but if you can control the pandemic, you do both. The worry, though, is about the schools is that, we have grandchildren. These grandchildren go to private schools. They haven't lost a single day of schooling so far. That's not true for kids who are in public schools. And it's even worse for those kids who don't have a fast internet connection or can't do that. And that educational deprivation will have effects that go on for a really long time. Life expectancy will bounce back up again next year or the year after, but that education is a loss forever, and it's going to divide the social classes even more. So that's very worrying.
It's also the case, though, that among Democrats and Republicans in the US, there's a real difference in what people think about going to college. So among Republicans, something close to a majority of them think that college is useless, that it's they're actually very anti-college because they think of college as being elite. And so that there's that going on as well in the US. So that this idea of a meritocracy and people who are talented rising to the top, well, people who don't go to college feel that there's a system here that's rigged against them. And in part, they're right, that when people succeed, they want to make sure their children succeed. So in the US, that oftentimes means we send them to private schools. We do everything we can to groom them for the best universities. And everyone else is just left out in the cold. So there's a real tension in the US, I think, around college-educated people versus not college-educated people.
Yeah, that used not to be there. There was a general agreement that colleges and universities were good things, and now a majority of Republicans think they're doing a bad job.
As you brought in this political polarization at the moment in the US and elsewhere, I must say, you've spoken about the fact that this health crisis in the US is geographically very widespread, and the problem has arisen in basically every single state. But at some point, I think in your research, you also pointed out that there is a broad overlap between the counties that were most affected by the opioid crisis and the counties that voted for Trump in 2016. I was wondering if this pattern held in 2020, and if you have any data on this.
Yes,
Yeah.
it did.
Yes.
Even life expectancy, at birth is now very, very strongly correlated with, say, across states, with the fraction who voted for Trump. So it's interesting, the four states what were they called? The battleground states: North Carolina, Georgia, Michigan, Wisconsin and Arizona and Nevada. They have almost all identical life expectancy. And then you go to states like Hawaii, which do better than anywhere else. Hardly anyone voted for Donald Trump. And at the other end, if you go to states like Louisiana or Arkansas or West Virginia, they have terrible life expectancy, and they all voted for Donald Trump. So that's still there in the 2020 data. I don't think we've looked at the counties, but at the state level, that correlation is like 0.7. It's a very, very high correlation.
Now, the electorate, at least a majority of it, has decided it was time to move on, and we have a new administration now. I was wondering if you think that, Biden will be able to tackle the crisis that you analyze. I'm not just talking about the healthcare system in general. If you have any idea what he should do, and realistically what he can do.
Well, both of those. It's clear that the previous administration didn't have much interest in our work. It's also clear that this administration has a lot of interest in our work. So that Janet Yellen, long before she was Secretary of the Treasury, was a very strong supporter of our work and was very interested in it. And she's read the book, and so has the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, Cecilia Rice. And so, the what's possible is obviously a real constraint. But there's no doubt at all that this administration understands what the problems are. And for instance, tomorrow afternoon, we're talking to Senator Sanders' staff about some of these issues. And so, there's certainly an awareness in Washington and a willingness in this administration to take on some of those issues to do with healthcare and, to do with less educated Americans.
Well, when $1.05 is going to one industry, here the healthcare industry, it's so powerful that I am not terribly optimistic about our ability to put a ceiling on prices that are being charged in the US, especially now that Johnson & Johnson, for example, has a vaccine that's effective, and now the pharma companies who had been a villain now are the heroes because these vaccines were developed so quickly and they're effective. So it's not clear exactly where we're going to land when it comes to real reform, which is desperately needed.
Yeah, and their allies in Washington, in the press and elsewhere, are saying, you guys that attacked the pharma companies, you were completely wrong. Look what they're doing for us now, and you have to let them make money, and you have to let them do all this stuff because we really need them when we really need them, they came through for us. But I made the analogy there. Imagine you were living in a country that was plagued by pirates, and you had these people who were coming and stealing stuff from you, like the Danes used to do in Europe in medieval times. So So these pirates are coming and stealing and raping and murdering people, and they're a great plague. But then you get attacked by another country, and you go to the pirates and you say, hey, we'll really pay you off if you help us with this other country. And so they help you with the other country, and they get rid of the other country. And you think, great, these pirates are good people. But the trouble is that once they've got rid of the other country, they're quite likely to turn back to you and take you all over again. So I'm not sure the fact that they've done so well during the pandemic, which they have, means that they're fundamentally good and well structured and that they don't need serious reform.
So in a way, what's happened with the pandemic is a kind of an image makeover, right? Or a huge public relations success for the pharma companies. I mean, they were the villains, as Ankeza said. They were exposed as, as the bad guys in the opioid crisis. I'm thinking of Purdue, for instance, the producers of OxyContin. And now, they come out quite well in terms of image. So this will, your fear from what you're saying, from what I get, is that this will delay the reckoning with what's wrong with them and the system?
Yes, but on the other side of that is the fact that when 20 million people lost their jobs in the first weeks of the shutdown in March a year ago, a very large fraction of those people would have lost their health insurance simultaneously. So the job is gone and the health insurance is gone, and they're scrambling to try to find coverage. During a pandemic, they lose their health insurance. So, and about 1 million people in the US have been hospitalized now with COVID. And whether or not they're going to face tens of thousands of dollars of healthcare bills that they cannot pay, that might work in favor of healthcare reform. So there's, it's on both sides. It's not really clear how this will settle down in the end, whether enough people are going to be angry at the system that they decide it is time for reform.
And the chairman of the relevant committee in the Senate is now Bernie Sanders. And he had hearings just yesterday on pharmaceutical pricing, for example. So there's a big difference between having Bernie Sanders in charge and whoever was in charge of that before, who was, supporting the pharma company. So this is going to be fought out. It's going to be difficult. But, in the end, what we've had in the past is really not sustainable. It's also very important to note that the basic RNA technology, which underlies the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, was developed at the National Institutes of Health, not actually by the pharma companies. Now, you need the pharma companies to produce it, to test it, to do all this stuff, which they did very quickly and did very well. But that doesn't mean we hand them the whole country, we finish with them and say, do what you like with us. So that will get sorted out.
Now, I want to go back to something that we've talked about before, this educational divide and the fact that this filters down to the labor market and then to basically redistribution. There's one sentence that struck me in the book, which is that what's been applied here is the distribution from the bottom to the top, like not Robin Hood would do by stealing to the rich and giving to the poor, but like the Sheriff of Nottingham would do, which I found it very appropriate, that is stealing from the poor and giving to the rich. So that's another issue that you deal extensively in the book, the issue of redistribution. And I was wondering, this is not the core of the book, but it's something that you tackle, the question of redistribution. I was wondering what you think it can be done, considering that you now have a president in the United States, a generally considered a trade union friendly president. Of course, the erosion of trade union powers is another thing that you talk about as a possible contributing factor. Also, there are proposals for a minimum wage. I mean, they've been rejected for the moment, or been taken out of the first Biden package. Will all these things help solving the problem?
Yeah, I think so. It's obviously going to be difficult to get them passed for the reasons that you talk about. But the next big thing that's going to come back is an even bigger bill in Congress for building infrastructure. And that's supposedly got a price tag of around $3 trillion. And Janet Yellen has made it very clear that that's not going to be done just by not taxing people, but it will be funded by higher taxes, perhaps higher corporation tax, perhaps higher capital gains tax, by undoing some of the giveaways that the Trump administration gave in its first year. So that will certainly help. It'll provide better jobs. It'll provide better infrastructure, which we need. The minimum wage is hard because on procedural grounds, it couldn't be forced through the Senate. And so we'll have to see what happens with that. But there's no doubt at all that this administration is very strong on the union side. The other thing that needs to be done is there have been laws over the past 20 or 30 years which have made it harder and harder and harder for unions to represent their members. And the Supreme Court has played a big part in that. But once again, this administration, I'm sure, will do what it can to push in that direction. Those things would really help. And I think Anne and I hope that the union movement, which has lost a tremendous number of members because it's been sort of prevented from helping them, will have somewhat of a rebirth. And I mean, one big fight that's going on right now, and it'll be determined the next few days, is the unionization of an Amazon warehouse fulfillment center in Alabama. And one of the interesting things is Senator Marco Rubio of Florida, who's a right-wing figure, has actually been pressing for unionization of those plants. And I think some of the populist wing of the Republican Party will push in that direction too. So maybe we'll see some restoration of unions and their role in the economy.
You said earlier that you're not 100% sure that what can be done in terms of healthcare reform, but even in the first package, in the first Biden package, there were some measures directed aimed at making, for instance, access to what's known as Obamacare easier. And what I found interesting, at least that's a story I read, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal that, or in the New York Times, that some of the states that are, normally not quite considered very friendly towards Obamacare, like Alabama and Wyoming, they decided that they would take up these measures and promote more spending or more equitable spending in healthcare. Do you see that as an encouraging sign? I mean, or is it just something, that will help, but it will not be decisive?
This administration has certainly made it easier for states to do that by subsidizing them further. The problem with that, as is the problem with Obamacare, I mean, the good thing about Obamacare is it insured a lot of people who were not insured before. And that was a major achievement. It was the major aim of the legislation. But it did nothing to make it cheaper. In fact, it may have made it more expensive because the government is saying we'll pay even more. And it was interesting with Obamacare that the pharma companies, the hospitals, the doctors were all in favor of it. And they were all in favor of it because they were all making money off it. So it did insure more people. And the same is true of what's being done now. But it does nothing about tackling the cost side. And we don't think that can be done without going to a single payer system, which is probably impossible right now. Biden in his campaign said they would introduce a public option into Obamacare, which would mean there would be an option for people to choose not to be covered by the private sector, but be covered by the state. If that really is effective and it undercuts these other plans, then that really could make a difference to cost containment. But it's not being done so far.
I think, and also whatever happens will probably have to happen relatively slowly, because if $1.05 is going into the healthcare industry, that's a lot of people's incomes, right? So there's a big insurance industry as part of this. People making money, their take home is coming out of the pockets of regular people, but it's their income. So if over time there's a public option which is attractive enough, then the insurance industry should get smaller as people leave it and find jobs elsewhere. I don't think it's something that we can do overnight, because it would be too big a rupture of how a very large number of people are currently being employed, which is in that industry.
Now, a lot of course, what attracts a lot of attention in the books are these figures, which are quite striking, about the opioid crisis, the deaths of despair, and maybe less focuses or less attention is being paid to the other part, that's the future capitalism part. And I think in the book, you touch on the fact that there is a backlash against globalization, and you also quote a number of studies which, prove or claim that, in fact, that's not the main driver of the conditions of the working class in America, and, it's not highly significant. But now with the pandemic again, which may feed into this anti-globalization narrative, and also possibly increase the risk of protectionism. We're seeing even what's happening with the vaccine protectionism. Is that a worry that you have, that this backlash against globalization will be fed by this by the new situation?
I'm not so sure it'd be such a bad thing if globalization slowed down a little bit compared with what it was in before the financial crisis. And in fact, globalization has been slowing since then, even before the pandemic. And I think after the pandemic, there'll be a sense that we want to guarantee our own supplies. We don't want to find ourselves in the middle of a pandemic having to get stuff from elsewhere. That's a complicated argument, because if you don't produce stuff, you have to get it from somewhere else. And if you don't have the global links, that's a really big problem. But I don't think I have any doubt that globalization is going to slow down for a number of reasons. And the US-China hostility is not the least of those. The vaccine nationalism is a little bit different. I mean, part of it is, I think, because Italy prohibited exports of AstraZeneca for a while. Some of that is just the failures of distribution in the EU for whatever reason, which has made countries very unwilling to let other people have what they can't have themselves. It's obviously right that we need to vaccinate the whole world. And as people like to say and have said over and over again, no country can get out of this pandemic until every country gets out of this pandemic. That's true. On the other hand, even here in America, where we've been very successful in vaccinating people, probably second only to Britain, there are many, many people around here who would love to get a vaccine and still can't get a vaccine. And those people are not going to support politicians who say, I'm sorry, you can't have a vaccine because we need to export that vaccine to Nigeria or to India or to the Congo or something, especially as those countries have not had very many deaths compared with the deaths in Europe and the United States. So I'm not too worried about the vaccine nationalism, because I think that will relax once there's an enormous amount of supply. And there are many new vaccines being developed that are not available yet, but will be. Many of them are designed to be cheap. There's a huge amount of manufacturing capacity in India and Brazil, China, which eventually will come online. And, I think that problem will go away. But I think in the long run, we're not going to see the hyper-globalization that we used to have, in the first decade of this century.
But probably globalization and also immigration in the US both become targets because you can see that happening. But probably a bigger threat to this labor force, to this part of the labor market, is actually innovation. It's that robots are coming in, robots are taking jobs, and that how you protect a labor force whose jobs are going to robots, we haven't solved yet.
Right. Well, thank you very much. We're very fast coming to the end of the time that was allotted to us. And I know that Professor Deaton has another commitment shortly. So I would like to thank you both very much. And hopefully we'll leave people with more of the optimism of the Great Escape and less with the pessimism of death of despair. And thanks again, Professor Case, Professor Deaton, from all the people at Il Mulino, and thank to the people who listen to us via the various platforms.
Thanks, everybody. Very much. It's a great treat to be back in with Il Mulino. I only wish we could be in Bologna. We sure miss all the restaurants and things that we'd be doing if we were really there. Yeah. So thank you.
We can't wait to be back.
We will have you in person as soon as it is possible.
Excellent.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.